Sometimes the hardest battles aren't against time or nature, but against our own stubborn hearts. When you've spent a lifetime fixing everything yourself, asking for help feels like admitting defeat. Earl Whitcomb knew this truth better than most. The 67-year-old retired mechanic lived alone in his farmhouse, making do with what he had. When he fell in the barn and cut his leg badly, he did what came natural, cleaned the wound and wrapped it with duct tape. No doctors, no bills he couldn't afford. 3 days later, Julie spotted him limping through the grocery store. She was a nurse who once dated his son before the boy left town for good. One look at Earl's homemade bandage told her everything. She needed to know. Would his pride end up costing him his leg? Or maybe something even more precious? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn crept through the kitchen window of the old Whitcomb farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Earl had been awake for 20 minutes already, sitting at the same oak table where he'd share breakfast with Martha for 38 years. The coffee was strong and black, just the way she'd always made it, though his hands weren't quite as steady as they used to be when he poured it from the dented aluminum percolator. The house creaked around him like an old friend settling into a comfortable chair. Every sound had meaning. The gentle groan of the floorboards in the hallway meant the temperature was dropping. The soft whistle of wind through the kitchen window frame told him the weather stripping needed replacing again. And the rhythmic tick of the mantel clock marked time the way it had since Martha's mother had given it to them as a wedding gift. Earl pushed back from the table and walked to the window, his bare feet knowing every squeaky spot on the floor. The farm stretched out before him in the gray morning light, 43 acres of what used to be productive land, now mostly gone to grass and weeds, except for the vegetable garden he still maintained behind the house. The red barn stood solid and weathered, its paint peeling, but its bones still strong. He'd built that barn himself in 1987, every board and nail placed with his own hands. On the kitchen counter, propped against the sugar bowl, stood a faded color photograph in a simple wooden frame. Martha smiled back at him from their wedding day, her dark hair pinned up with small white flowers, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that comes from believing in forever. She'd been gone 3 years now, taken by the cancer that had drained their savings as surely as it had drained the life from her small frame. The medical bills still arrived occasionally, forwarded from the hospital's billing department with a polite but firm reminders that payment was expected. Earl kept them in a shoebox under the bed, not because he intended to ignore them forever, but because looking at those numbers, $47,000 for the last month alone, made his chest feel tight and his hands shake. The life insurance had covered the funeral and not much more. His Social Security check covered the utilities and basic groceries, but there wasn't much left over for luxuries like health insurance or doctor visits. He dressed slowly, pulling on work pants that had seen better decades and a flannel shirt that Martha had mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from her careful patches. His hands marked with the permanent stains and small scars of a lifetime, working with engines and tools, moved with practiced efficiency despite their slight tremor. Those hands had rebuilt transmissions, delivered calves, fixed neighbors' lawnmowers for free, and held Martha's hand through every one of her chemotherapy treatments. Outside, the morning air was crisp with the promise of winter. Earl made his way across the yard to the barn, noting automatically that the gate to the chicken coop was hanging crooked again. Another item for his mental list of repairs. He'd built that coop in 1991, and it housed hundreds of chickens over the years. Now it held just 6 hens, enough to keep him in eggs and give him something to tend to each morning. The barn smelled of hay and old wood and motor oil, a combination that had always meant home to Earl. His workbench occupied the far wall, its scarred surface covered with coffee cans full of sorted screws, nuts, and bolts. Above it, tools hung in precise order on a pegboard, each item in its designated spot, outlined in black markers so he could tell at a glance if something was missing. This system had served him well during his 32 years running Whitcomb's auto repair in town, and he saw no reason to change it now. In the corner stood his pride and joy, a 1967 Chevelle that he'd been restoring for the past 5 years. The body was straight and rust-free, painted a deep blue that gleamed even in the dim barn light. The engine, a 396 big block that he'd rebuilt twice, sat under the hood like a sleeping giant. He'd bought the car from a farmer's widow for $300, seeing past the flat tires and mouse-eaten upholstery to the solid bones. Underneath, Earl ran his hand along the car's fender, feeling the smooth metal beneath his palm. This was the car he'd planned to surprise Martha with, maybe take her on a drive through the countryside like they used to do when they were courting. She'd always loved those Sunday afternoon drives, her hand resting on his knee as they explored the back roads of their county. Now the car sat as a monument to plans that would never unfold. The sound of a truck in his driveway broke the morning. Quiet. Through the barn's side window, Earl could see his neighbor Frank Kowalski climbing out of his pickup, a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and what looked like a plate covered with a dish towel in the other. Frank was a good man, 10 years younger than Earl, but with the same practical approach to life that came from working the land. His wife Dorothy had been Martha's closest friend, and since Martha's passing, the Kowalskis had made it their mission to check on Earl regularly. "Morning, Earl," Frank called as he approached the barn. Dorothy sent over some of her coffee cake, said it was too much for just the two of us. Earl wiped his hands on an old rag and walked out to meet his friend. Frank's face was weathered from years of farming, his eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses that were perpetually smudged with dust and fingerprints. The man had a way of offering help that didn't feel like charity, a skill Earl appreciated more than Frank could know. "That woman spoils me," Earl said, accepting the plate. The coffee cake was still warm, and the smell of cinnamon and butter made his stomach growl. "Tell her I said thank you. She worries about you eating right," Frank said, leaning against the barn's doorframe. "We both do. This old place is too much for one person to handle." Earl felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever someone suggested he might not be capable of taking care of himself. "I've been managing just fine," he said, his voice carrying more edge than he'd intended. Frank raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I know you have. Just saying, if you ever need anything, a ride to town, help with repairs, anything at all, you know where to find me." "I appreciate that, Frank. I truly do." Earl's voice softened. These offers of help came from love, he knew that. But accepting them felt like stepping onto a slippery slope that led to assisted living facilities and giving up the independence he'd fought so hard to maintain. After Frank left, Earl stood in his driveway and surveyed his domain. The mailbox at the end of the drive leaned at a slight angle, another repair for his list. The gravel driveway was getting thin in spots, showing patches of the dirt underneath. The house itself, a 2-story farmhouse built in 1924, wore its age like a comfortable sweater. The white paint was faded and peeling in places, but the structure underneath was sound. Earl had made sure of that, checking the foundation every spring, replacing boards as needed, keeping the roof in good repair. This was his life now, a careful balance of making do and making repairs, stretching every dollar and every resource as far as it would go. He'd learned to cut his own hair, mend his own clothes, and diagnose his own aches and pains with the same practical approach he'd once applied to troubled engines. Some problems could be fixed with the right tool and enough patience. Others just had to be endured. The vegetable garden behind the house was his greatest success. Even at 67, he could still coax impressive harvests from the rich soil. Tomatoes, green beans, corn, and potatoes, enough to feed himself through the summer and preserve for winter. Martha had taught him to can vegetables. Those jars never looked quite as neat as hers had. The garden represented something important to Earl, proof that he could still provide for himself, still create something valuable with his own hands. As the morning wore on, Earl worked his way through his daily routine. He fed the chickens, collected eggs, checked the fence line for damage, and made a mental note to replace a loose board in the barn siding. Each task was performed with the deliberate care of a man who understood that maintenance delayed was often maintenance multiplied. By noon, he was back in the kitchen, making himself a sandwich from leftover ham and bread he'd baked himself. The act of baking had been one of Martha's skills that he'd been forced to learn after her death. His loaves weren't as light as hers had been, but they were edible and economical. He discovered that many things he'd thought were beyond his capabilities were simply skills he'd never needed to develop. The afternoon found him in his workshop, tinkering with a small engine that belonged to Mrs. Patterson's lawnmower. She'd brought it by the previous week, along with a jar of her homemade preserves and strict instructions not to charge her anything. Earl couldn't bring himself to turn away these small repair jobs. Even though he no longer had a proper shop, the work kept his hands busy and his mind sharp, and the gratitude of his neighbors meant more to him than any payment could. As evening approached, Earl sat on his front porch, watching the sun set behind the oak tree that Martha had planted the year they moved to the farm. The tree was massive now, its branches spreading wide enough to shade half the front yard. In the summer, it provided blessed relief from the heat. In the autumn, its leaves turned brilliant gold and red before carpeting the ground with nature's confetti. The rocking chair creaked gently as Earl moved back and forth, its rhythm as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. This had been Martha's chair, and sometimes in the evening light, he could almost see her sitting beside him, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on another project for the church bazaar. She'd been the social one in their marriage, the bridge that connected Earl to the community. Without her, he felt somewhat adrift, like a boat that had lost its anchor. The phone rang inside the house, its shrill tone cutting through the peaceful evening air. Earl considered ignoring it. Telemarketers and bill collectors were about the only people who called anymore. But the persistent ringing finally drove him inside. "Hello? Dad?" The voice on the other end was familiar but distant, both geographically and emotionally. "Tommy." Earl settled into the kitchen chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 67 years. This is a surprise. Thomas Whitcomb lived in Seattle now, working for some technology company that Earl couldn't begin to understand. He had Martha's intelligence and Earl's stubborn streak, a combination that had served him well in his career, but had also driven a wedge between father and son. Tommy called every few months, duty calls that felt more obligatory than affectionate. "How are you holding up, Dad? I've been thinking about you." "I'm fine, son. Keeping busy." Earl looked around the kitchen, at the worn linoleum and faded wallpaper, and wondered if Tommy remembered what home had looked like when Martha was alive. "How's the job?" "Good. Really good. Actually, that's part of why I'm calling." Tommy's voice carried that careful tone he used when he was about to deliver news that Earl wouldn't want to hear. "I've been promoted again. They're making me a senior manager." "That's wonderful, Tommy. Your mother would be proud." Thanks. But the thing is, with this promotion comes more money, and I've been thinking, maybe it's time you considered moving out here, or at least closer to some better medical facilities. I could help with the expenses, find you a nice apartment. I'm not leaving the farm, Tommy." Earl's voice was firm but not unkind. They'd had this conversation before, in various forms, and it always ended the same way. "Dad, be reasonable. You're 67 years old, living alone on 43 acres, with no close neighbors. What if something happens? What if you fall, or have a heart attack? Or what if the sun doesn't come up tomorrow? Earl interrupted. A man can't live his life worrying about every what if that comes along. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Tommy growing more frustrated and Earl growing more entrenched in his position. When they finally hung up, Earl felt drained and slightly guilty. He knew his son cared about him, knew that the offers of help came from love. But Tommy didn't understand that leaving the farm would be like cutting away a piece of his soul. That night, Earl lay in the bed he'd shared with Martha for nearly 4 decades, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around him. The furnace kicked on with a gentle whoosh. The refrigerator hummed its steady song. And somewhere in the walls, a mouse scurried about its nocturnal business. These sounds, once shared with someone else, now served as his only companions in the darkness. He thought about Tommy's call, about Frank's worried glances, about the bills in the shoebox under the bed. Change was coming, whether he wanted it or not. Age was the one enemy that couldn't be outfought or outlasted, and Earl was beginning to feel its pressure in ways both small and large. His hands weren't as strong as they used to be. His back ached after long days of work, and his eyesight, while still functional, wasn't quite as sharp as it once had been. But this was his home, his life, his choice to make. He'd built something here with Martha, something that went beyond property lines and mortgage payments. This farm held their history, their dreams, their love story written in every improvement they'd made together. The thought of leaving it all behind, of becoming just another elderly man in an apartment somewhere, filled him with a quiet desperation that he couldn't quite name. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new repairs to make, new problems to solve. Earl Whitcomb had been solving problems his entire life, and he wasn't about to stop now. He closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, unaware that the next morning would bring a problem unlike any he'd faced before, one that couldn't be fixed with the contents of his toolbox or the strength of his stubborn will. The morning of November 15th dawned gray and bitter, with a thin skin of ice coating everything the overnight frost had touched. Earl woke to the sound of sleet tapping against his bedroom window like impatient fingers, and he knew without looking that the day would require extra caution. At 67, he'd learned to read weather the way other men read newspapers, carefully and with respect for what it might mean. He made his coffee stronger than usual, needing the extra warmth to push back against the cold that seemed to seep through the old farmhouse's walls. Despite his best efforts at weatherproofing, the kitchen thermometer read 32 degrees, right at the freezing point that made everything treacherous. Ice was a farmer's enemy, turning familiar paths into potential disasters and routine chores into dangerous gambles. After breakfast, Earl bundled himself in his heavy work coat, the one Martha had bought him for Christmas 5 years ago. The sleeves were frayed at the cuffs, and there was a small tear near the left pocket. But it was warm, and it fit him like an old friend's embrace. He pulled on his work boots. The leather cracked, but the treads still deep enough to provide decent grip on slippery surfaces. The walk to the barn required careful steps, his boots crunching through the thin ice that had formed over yesterday's puddles. The chickens were huddled in their coop, smart enough to stay put when the weather turned nasty. Earl scattered their feed and collected the 3 eggs they'd managed to produce, noting that the waterer would need attention before the day was out. Frozen water meant no eggs tomorrow, and he couldn't afford to lose production during the winter months. Inside the barn, the air was marginally warmer, but still cold enough to make his breath visible in small puffs. The 6 Holstein cows he kept for milk production stood patiently in their stalls, their large eyes watching him with the calm patience that cattle seemed to possess naturally. Earl had always found comfort in their presence. They asked for little beyond food, water, and basic care, and they provided milk that he sold to a local dairy for enough money to help with the grocery bills. The hayloft stretched above the main barn floor, accessed by a wooden ladder that Earl had built himself 20 years ago. The bales stored up there would last through the winter if he was careful, but moving them down to the feeding area was becoming more of a challenge with each passing year. What had once been a simple matter of climbing up, tossing bales down, and carrying them to the feeding troughs now required more planning and considerably more effort. Earl climbed the ladder slowly, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it. The wood was solid, he'd built it to last, but ice had a way of making even the most reliable surfaces unpredictable. At the top, he surveyed his hay supply with the practiced eye of someone who'd been feeding livestock for decades. The bales were stacked neatly, each one representing hours of summer work when the weather had been hot and the future had seemed more certain. He selected a bale from the nearest stack, one that looked well cured and free from the mold that sometimes developed when hay was baled too green. The bale weighed roughly 60 pounds, manageable for a man of his size and experience, though he could remember when such weights had felt like nothing at all. Age was a thief that stole strength gradually, so slowly that you didn't notice the loss until you tried to do something that had once been effortless. The plan was simple. Push the bale to the edge of the loft, lower it down with a rope to control its descent, then climb down and drag it to the feeding area. It was a system he'd used countless times, safe and efficient when performed with proper care. But the universe has a way of reminding us that even the most familiar routines can turn dangerous in an instant. As Earl maneuvered the bale toward the edge of the loft, his right boot struck a patch of ice that had formed where a small roof leak had dripped and frozen overnight. The ice was nearly invisible, a thin sheet that might as well have been greased glass. His foot shot forward, his balance shifted catastrophically, and suddenly he was falling with the sickening certainty that comes just before impact. He landed hard on his left side, his leg striking a rusty hay hook that protruded from one of the support posts. The hook was old, something left over from the barn's earlier days when such tools were common. Earl had always meant to remove it, had even mentioned it to Martha once as a safety hazard, but like many small repairs, it had been forgotten in the press of more urgent needs. The pain hit him like a physical blow, starting at the point of impact and radiating outward in waves that made his vision blur and his stomach lurch. For a moment, he lay still, taking inventory of his body the way he might assess damage to a machine after a breakdown. His ribs ached but didn't feel broken. His shoulder was sore but functional. His head had missed the concrete floor by inches, a piece of luck that might have saved his life. But his left leg was a different story entirely. Blood was already seeping through his work pants, spreading in a dark stain that looked almost black. In the dim barn light, Earl sat up carefully, his hands shaking from shock and adrenaline, and rolled up his pant leg to assess the damage. The hay hook had caught him just below the knee, tearing through the fabric and into the flesh beneath. With the efficiency of a blade designed for cutting, the wound was roughly 4 inches long and deep enough that he could see layers of tissue that were never meant to see daylight. Blood flowed steadily, but not in the spurting pattern that would indicate arterial damage, a small mercy that Earl recognized with the practical knowledge of someone who'd dealt with farm injuries before. Still, it was serious, the kind of injury that would send most people directly to the emergency room without a second thought. Earl knew the proper course of action. He should call 911, let the paramedics transport him to the county hospital, and let trained medical professionals clean and stitch the wound properly. It was what Martha would have insisted on, what any reasonable person would do when faced with such an injury. But Earl also knew what a trip to the emergency room would cost. Even a simple visit ran into thousands of dollars, and this would require stitches, probably x-rays to check for bone damage, antibiotics, and follow-up visits. The bills from Martha's final illness were still arriving 3 years after her death, and his financial situation hadn't improved in the interim. The hospital would treat him. They had to by law, but the bills would follow him for years, adding to the burden that already kept him awake at night. He sat on the barn floor for several minutes, watching blood pool beneath his leg and weighing his options. The responsible choice was clear, but responsibility was a luxury he couldn't afford. At 67, with limited income and no health insurance, every medical decision carried financial consequences that extended far beyond immediate problem. Finally, Earl pulled himself to his feet, testing his weight on the injured leg. It hurt, but it held him. The bleeding was slowing slightly, though it hadn't stopped. He limped to his workbench, each step sending fresh jolts of pain up his leg, and began gathering supplies. The barn's first aid kit was basic but functional, assembled over years of dealing with minor cuts, scrapes, and the occasional accident that came with farm life. Antiseptic, gauze, medical tape, and various bandages filled a metal toolbox that had once held wrenches and screwdrivers. Earl had learned basic wound care out of necessity. When you lived 20 minutes from town and worked with sharp tools and unpredictable animals, you learned to handle minor medical problems yourself. But this wasn't minor, and Earl knew it. He cleaned the wound as best he could with antiseptic and water from the barn's utility sink, gritting his teeth against the burning pain. The cut was too deep for simple bandaging, the edges too far apart to heal properly without being pulled together. In a hospital, it would receive stitches, maybe 15 or 20 of them, holding the wound closed while the body's natural healing process took over. Earl didn't have stitches, but he had something else. On his workbench, next to a collection of wrenches and a half-empty coffee can filled with bolts, sat a roll of silver duct tape. It was the same brand he'd been using for decades, reliable and strong, capable of holding together everything from broken water pipes to torn truck tarps. He'd used it to repair lawnmower handles, patch holes in grain bins, and even temporarily fix a crack in his truck's radiator hose. The idea that formed in Earl's mind was born from desperation and a lifetime of making do with whatever was available. Duct tape was designed to hold things together under pressure, to create a seal that would withstand stress and moisture. A wound, when reduced to its basic components, was simply two pieces of flesh that needed to be held together while they healed. Earl tore off several strips of tape, each about 6 inches long. Working methodically despite the pain, he pressed the edges of the wound together with one hand and applied the tape with the other, pulling the torn flesh into alignment and holding it there with the adhesive's grip. The tape adhered well to his skin, creating a silver bandage that covered the entire length of the cut. He wrapped gauze around the makeshift repair, more to protect the tape than from any belief in the gauze's healing properties, and secured it with medical tape. The result looked professional enough, he thought, like something a paramedic might do in the field. When proper materials weren't available, the pain had settled into a steady throb that was manageable as long as he didn't put too much weight on the leg. Earl tested his mobility, taking a few careful steps around the barn. The tape held, showing no signs of loosening or failure. The bleeding had stopped completely, trapped beneath the silver seal that now covered his injury. For the first time since the fall, Earl allowed himself to feel a measure of satisfaction. He'd identified a problem, assessed the available resources, and engineered a solution using materials at hand. It was the same approach he'd used to solve mechanical problems for decades, adapted to address a medical challenge. The methodology was sound, even if the application was unconventional. He spent the rest of the morning moving carefully around the barn, completing his chores with studied patience. The cattle still needed feeding, the chickens required attention, and the routine maintenance that kept the farm functioning couldn't be delayed simply because he'd had an accident. Earl had learned long ago that farms didn't pause for personal problems, that animals depended on their caretakers, regardless of circumstances. By noon, he was back in the farmhouse kitchen, elevating his leg on a chair while he ate a simple lunch of soup and crackers. The improvised bandage remained secure, showing no signs of bleeding or failure. The pain was present but manageable. No worse than the arthritis that plagued his hands on cold mornings or the back strain that sometimes followed heavy lifting. Earl spent the afternoon reading, something he'd done more of since Martha's death. The local library had a good selection of histories and biographies, books about people who'd faced challenges and overcome them through determination and resourcefulness. He found comfort in these stories, in the reminder that humans had always found ways to endure and adapt when circumstances demanded it. As evening approached, he examined his repair work again, carefully peeling back the gauze to check for signs of infection or failure. The tape held firm. The wound remained closed, and there was no evidence of the complications he'd been warned about in the first aid manuals he'd consulted. The skin around the injury was slightly red, but that seemed normal for a fresh wound. That night, Earl went to bed with a sense of cautious optimism. He'd faced a crisis and handled it using his own judgment and resources. The injury would heal, the tape would hold, and he would avoid the crushing medical bills that would have accompanied a hospital visit. It was a victory of sorts, proof that independence and self-reliance remained viable approaches to life's challenges. He had no way of knowing, as he drifted off to sleep, that 3 days later his improvised solution would be discovered by someone whose medical training would make her realize just how dangerous his homemade remedy truly was. Earl Whitcomb had always believed that most problems could be solved with the right tool and enough determination. He was about to learn that some problems required more than duct tape and stubborn pride. The first 24 hours after the accident passed in a haze of careful movement and cautious optimism. Earl woke that Thursday morning with his legs stiff but functional, the silver tape holding firm beneath the gauze wrapping. He'd slept better than expected, waking only twice when he shifted position and felt the pull of healing skin. The pain had settled into a manageable ache, no worse than the joint stiffness that greeted him most mornings anyway. His routine required modification but not abandonment. He moved more slowly through his morning chores, favoring the injured leg and using a walking stick he'd carved years ago for Martha when her arthritis had been particularly troublesome. The stick felt good in his hands, solid maple with a smooth grip warmed by palm oil and thyme. Martha had used it only briefly before declaring it too rustic for her taste, but Earl had kept it hanging in the kitchen closet, and now he was grateful for its steady support. The chickens seemed to sense his altered gait, clustering around his feet with unusual attention as he scattered their feed. Animals had an uncanny ability to detect weakness, Earl had noticed over the years. They weren't cruel about it, just naturally curious about changes in their caretaker's behavior. The old rooster, a Rhode Island red named Chester, fixed Earl, with one bright eye as if assessing whether this limping human was still capable of providing adequate service. "Don't worry, Chester," Earl murmured, distributing the feed with practiced efficiency. "Takes more than a scratch to slow down this old man." But even as he spoke the words, Earl felt the first whisper of doubt. The wound throbbed with each heartbeat, a steady reminder that his improvised repair was holding his body together with nothing more than adhesive and hope. He'd used duct tape to fix countless things over the years, but flesh and blood operated by different rules than metal and wood. What worked for a broken tractor part might not be sufficient for human tissue. Done by Friday morning, Earl had developed a pronounced limp that he tried to disguise when Frank Kowalski stopped by with another offering from Dorothy's kitchen. This time it was a pot of beef stew, still warm from the stove, with a note instructing Earl to return the pot clean, but not to worry about timing. "You're moving a little stiff today," Frank observed as they stood in Earl's driveway, his farmer's eye picking up on subtle changes that others might miss. "Back giving you trouble again?" "Just the weather," Earl replied, shifting his weight to his good leg. "Cold snaps got all my joints complaining." Frank nodded sympathetically. At 57, He was beginning to experience his own collection of aches and pains, though nothing as severe as what Earl dealt with on a daily basis. Dorothy says to tell you she's making her apple pie tomorrow if you want to come for dinner Sunday. She worries you're not eating enough. The invitation was generous and well-meaning, but Earl knew he couldn't manage the walk to the Kowalski farm or the stairs to their dining room with his current injury. More troubling was his growing awareness that the wound might need attention beyond what his duct tape solution could provide. The skin around the edges had begun to feel warm to the touch, and there was a persistent burning sensation that seemed to be intensifying rather than diminishing. "Tell Dorothy I appreciate the invite," Earl said carefully. "Might have to take a rain check this week. Got some projects that need finishing before the really cold weather sets in." Frank studied Earl's face with the expression of someone who suspected he wasn't getting the complete truth, but good neighbors knew when to push and when to respect a man's privacy. "Well, the invitation stands. You know where to find us if you change your mind." After Frank left, Earl retreated to his kitchen and carefully unwrapped the gauze around his leg. What he found beneath made his stomach clench with worry. The edges of the wound, which had been pink and healthy-looking the day before, were now red and slightly swollen. The duct tape remained firmly in place, but the skin around it felt hot and tender to the touch. Most concerning of all was a thin line of yellowish discharge that had appeared along one edge of the tape dot. Earl had seen enough infected wounds on farm animals to recognize the signs. An infection was beginning to take hold. His body's attempt to fight off bacteria that had entered through the break in his skin. In cattle, such infections required immediate treatment with antibiotics and proper wound care. In humans, the consequences of delay could be far more serious. He cleaned around the tape as best he could without disturbing the primary seal, applying fresh antiseptic and wrapping the area with clean gauze. The burning sensation intensified with his ministrations, and he had to grip the kitchen counter to steady himself as waves of pain radiated up his leg. This was not the manageable discomfort he'd experienced the previous 2 days. This was his body sending an increasingly urgent message that something was going wrong. Saturday morning brought no improvement. If anything, the signs of infection had worsened overnight. The skin around the wound was definitely swollen now, creating ridges and valleys where the tape pulled against inflamed tissue. The discharge had increased, seeping around the edges of his repair and staining the gauze with yellowish-green fluid that smelled faintly of decay. Earl sat at his kitchen table, staring at his leg and trying to calculate the odds. On one hand, infections sometimes resolved on their own, especially in otherwise healthy individuals. His immune system had fought off countless minor illnesses over the years without medical intervention. On the other hand, leg wounds were notorious for developing serious complications, particularly in older adults whose circulation wasn't what it used to be. The rational part of his mind knew that he should seek medical attention. The infection was clearly beyond what home treatment could address, and the longer he waited, the more difficult and expensive treatment would become. But the bills from Martha's illness still haunted him, those impossible numbers that had turned their final months together into a constant struggle between love and financial reality. He'd already spent 3 days managing the situation on his own. Surely a few more days wouldn't make that much difference. Infections took time to develop into serious problems, and his was still relatively minor. He could increase his antiseptic treatments, maybe take some over-the-counter anti-inflammatory medication to reduce the swelling. People had been treating wounds without antibiotics for thousands of years before modern medicine came along. But even as Earl tried to convince himself that delay was reasonable, his body was providing contrary evidence. The throbbing in his leg had intensified to the point where it interfered with sleep, and he'd noticed a slight fever developing, nothing dramatic, just a persistent feeling of being too warm despite the cool weather. Most troubling of all Red streaks had begun to appear on the skin above the wound. Thin lines that seemed to be spreading slowly up his leg. Earl knew what those lines meant. He'd seen them on horses and cattle, the telltale sign that infection was moving through the lymphatic system, spreading from its point of origin toward more vital parts of the body. In animals, such streaks were an indication for immediate veterinary intervention. In humans, they suggested that time was running out for conservative treatment options. That evening, Earl called his son in Seattle. It was an unusual occurrence. Their conversations were typically initiated by Tommy, part of his dutiful check-ins rather than genuine exchanges. But Earl found himself needing to hear a familiar voice, even if that voice was likely to deliver unwelcome advice. "Dad, is everything okay?" Tommy's surprise was evident even through the phone connection. "You don't usually call." "I'm fine," Earl said automatically, then paused. The words felt false in his mouth, a denial of the increasingly obvious reality that he was not, in fact, fine at all. "Just wanted to hear how you're doing. How's the new position working out?" They talked for 20 minutes about Tommy's work, his apartment, the weather in Seattle. Earl found himself listening more to the sound of his son's voice than to the actual words, drawing comfort from the connection, even as he struggled with whether to mention his current situation. Part of him wanted to ask for advice, to share the burden of decision-making with someone who cared about his welfare. But a larger part recognized that Tommy's advice would be predictable and unwelcome. Go to the hospital, accept help, acknowledge that independence had its limits. "Dad, you sound tired," Tommy said as their conversation wound down. "Are you sure everything's okay? You sound different." Earl glanced down at his leg, where the infection was continuing its slow but steady advance despite his best efforts at home treatment. The smart thing to do would be to confess his situation, to accept that he'd made an error in judgment and needed professional help. But admitting that felt like admitting something larger about his ability to take care of himself, about his right to remain in the home he'd shared with Martha. "Just the usual aches and pains," Earl said finally. "Nothing that won't sort itself out with time." After he hung up, Earl sat in his kitchen and stared at the phone, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The infection was getting worse, not better, and his window for seeking treatment was narrowing with each passing hour. But the alternative, walking into a hospital emergency room and surrendering control of his health and finances to strangers, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd worked to maintain. He made himself a simple dinner and went to bed early, hoping that morning would bring improvement or at least clarity about what to do next. As he lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of his old house settling around him, Earl tried to remember when making decisions had become so difficult. There had been a time when problems had solutions, when right and wrong were clearly defined categories. Now everything seemed to exist in shades of gray, with no perfect choices available. The fever intensified during the night, bringing with it vivid dreams of Martha that felt more real than memory. She sat beside his bed in her favorite blue dress, her hand cool against his forehead, her voice gentle but firm as she told him things he didn't want to hear about pride and stubbornness and the difference between independence and self-destruction. "Earl Whitcomb," she said in the dream, her eyes holding the same mixture of love and exasperation they'd carried during their marriage. "You always were too stubborn for your own good. Some problems can't be fixed with duct tape and determination." Earl woke with her words echoing in his mind and the taste of fever thick in his mouth. Sunday morning had arrived, bringing with it a decision that could no longer be postponed. The infection had reached the point where home treatment was not just ineffective, but dangerous. The red streaks on his leg had spread several inches higher, and the burning pain had intensified to the point where walking required significant effort. He knew what Martha would tell him to do. He knew what Tommy would insist upon. He knew what any reasonable person would recommend. The The question was whether Earl Whitcomb was ready to admit that sometimes being reasonable mattered more than being independent, and whether he could accept help without feeling like he was surrendering everything that made him who he was. Sunday morning arrived gray and cold, with a bitter wind that seemed to find every gap in the farmhouse's weather stripping. Earl woke before dawn, his sleep interrupted by the persistent throbbing in his leg and a fever that left him alternately shivering and sweating. The infection had taken a firm hold now, no longer something he could dismiss as a minor complication of his improvised medical care. He made his way to the bathroom slowly, using Martha's walking stick and keeping most of his weight on his good leg. In the harsh fluorescent light above the sink, Earl got his first clear look at what 3 days of infection had done to his improvised repair. The duct tape was still holding, a testament to the adhesive's quality, but the skin around it told a different story entirely. The redness had spread in angry tendrils that reached nearly to his knee, following the pathways of his lymphatic system like a roadmap of infection. The swelling had increased overnight, making his left leg visibly larger than his right, and the heat radiating from the wound site was intense enough that he could feel it through the remaining gauze. Most alarming of all, the red streaks that had appeared the day before had continued their march up his leg, now extending several inches above the original wound site. Earl knew these signs well enough from his years of caring for livestock. An infection that moved through the lymphatic system was the body's way of announcing that local defenses had failed and the problem was becoming systemic. In cattle, such infections required immediate veterinary attention and aggressive antibiotic treatment. The human body operated by the same basic principles, and Earl's practical knowledge told him what his stubborn pride didn't want to acknowledge. He was running out of time to address this safely. The morning chores required tremendous effort. Each step sent jolts of pain up his leg, and the simple act of walking to the chicken coop left him slightly breathless and dizzy. The chickens seemed to sense his distress, gathering around him with unusual attention while he distributed their feed with hands that shook from fever and exhaustion. Chester, the old rooster, tilted his head and fixed Earl with one bright eye, as if trying to understand why his normally steady caretaker was moving like a wounded animal. There was something almost accusatory in that gaze, Earl thought, as if the bird was questioning his fitness to maintain the small flock that depended on him for survival. "I know, old boy," Earl murmured, steadying himself against the fence post. "Not at my best today, am I?" The walk back to the house took twice as long as usual, with Earl stopping frequently to rest and catch his breath. By the time he reached his kitchen, he was sweating despite the cold morning air, and the fever had intensified to the point where his thoughts felt sluggish and disconnected. He made coffee with hands that trembled, spilling grounds across the counter and struggling to remember how many scoops he'd already added to the percolator don as he waited for the coffee to brew. Earl found himself staring at the kitchen telephone, mounted on the wall beside the refrigerator. The device had been there for 15 years, a simple beige model that Martha had chosen because it matched the kitchen's color scheme. She'd made thousands of calls from that phone, to friends, to their son, to doctors during her final illness. Now it seemed to mock Earl with its silence, representing both connection and surrender. He could call 911. The paramedics would be there within 20 minutes. Professional and efficient, equipped with antibiotics and pain medication and all. The tools of modern emergency medicine. They would transport him to the county hospital, where doctors would clean his wound properly, remove the duct tape, and begin the aggressive treatment that the infection clearly required. That they would also generate bills that would haunt him for years to come. Emergency room visits started at several $1,000s before any actual treatment began. Antibiotics, x-rays, overnight observation. Follow-up visits, the costs would mount quickly, adding to the financial burden that already kept him awake at night. Earl had seen the bills from Martha's treatment, had watched their modest savings disappear into the vast machinery of modern healthcare. The coffee finished brewing with a final gurgle, and Earl poured himself a cup with hands that shook enough to slosh liquid onto the counter. The simple act of lifting the mug to his lips required concentration, and the coffee tasted odd, flat and metallic in a way that suggested his fever was affecting his ability to taste properly. He spent the morning in his recliner, dozing fitfully and trying to ignore the steady progression of symptoms that his body was reporting. The fever came in waves now, intense periods of heat followed by bone-deep chills that no amount of blankets could chase away. His leg throbbed with each heartbeat, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo through his entire body. Around noon, the sound of a vehicle in his driveway roused Earl from an uneasy sleep. Through the living room window, he could see Frank Kowalski's pickup truck, and his heart sank as he realized he would have to put on a performance of normalcy when he could barely stand without assistance. Frank knocked on the front door. Something he rarely did. Usually, he would call out a greeting and head directly to wherever Earl was working. But today he waited patiently on the porch until Earl could make his way to the door. The walk across the living room felt like a marathon, each step requiring careful planning and considerable effort. "Morning, Earl," Frank said as the door opened. His expression shifted immediately from casual friendliness to concern as he took in Earl's appearance. "Dorothy sent me to check on you. She said you looked pale when she saw you yesterday from the kitchen window." Earl tried to smile, but the expression felt forced and unconvincing. "Just fighting off a little bug, I think. Nothing serious." Frank's farmer's eye, trained by decades of assessing the health of livestock, wasn't fooled by Earl's attempt at normalcy. The older man was clearly running a fever, his face flushed and eyes slightly glazed, and there was something wrong with the way he was standing, favoring his left leg in a way that suggested injury rather than simple stiffness. "You don't look good, Earl. Dorothy's right to be worried." Frank stepped closer, his voice taking on the gentle but firm tone he used with sick animals. "When's the last time you saw a doctor?" "Don't need a doctor for every little ache and pain," Earl replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The effort of standing in the doorway was making him dizzy, and he had to grip the doorframe to keep from swaying. Frank studied Earl's face for a moment, clearly debating how far to push. Good neighbors respected boundaries, but they also looked out for each other, especially when someone was obviously in distress. "Earl, you're burning up with fever, and you're not putting weight on your left leg. What happened?" The question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer that Earl wasn't prepared to give. Admitting to his accident would lead to questions about medical treatment, and admitting to his improvised repair would reveal just how desperate his financial situation had become. But the fever was making it difficult to think clearly, and Earl found himself struggling to maintain the facade of normalcy. "Had a little spill in the barn a few days back," he said finally. "Nothing serious. Just banged up my leg a bit." Frank's expression grew more concerned. "A few days back? Earl, that leg needs looking at. If you're running a fever from a leg injury, that could be serious. Real serious." "It's fine," Earl insisted, but even as he spoke the words, he felt his strength ebbing. The conversation was taking more energy than he had to spare, and the edges of his vision were beginning to blur in a way that suggested his body was approaching some kind of limit. Frank must have seen something in Earl's face that alarmed him, because he stepped forward and caught Earl's arm as the older man swayed dangerously. "That's it. I'm calling Dorothy, and we're taking you to the hospital. No arguments." "No hospitals," Earl said, but his voice was weak, and his protests felt hollow even to himself. "Can't afford. Money's not worth dying over, Earl," Frank said firmly. "Martha wouldn't want you suffering like this out of stubborn pride." The mention of Martha hit Earl like a physical blow. He could almost see her standing beside Frank, her arms crossed, and her expression carrying that particular mixture of love and exasperation that meant she was about to deliver a lecture about taking care of himself. She would have dragged him to the hospital days ago, probably would have called the ambulance herself rather than watch him suffer. Just need to rest, Earl mumbled, but he was leaning heavily on Frank now, his body making the decision that his mind couldn't seem to manage. Frank helped Earl back to his recliner and then went to the kitchen to call Dorothy. Earl could hear the murmur of conversation, Frank's voice urgent and worried as he described Earl's condition. The words fever, infection, and hospital drifted back to the living room, each one feeling like another nail in the coffin of Earl's independence. When Frank returned, he was carrying Earl's coat and a determined expression. "Dorothy's meeting us at the emergency room. She's calling ahead to let them know we're coming." Earl wanted to protest, wanted to assert his right to make his own medical decisions, but the fever had sapped his ability to argue effectively. Besides, a part of him, the part that had been growing more frightened with each passing hour, was relieved that someone else was finally taking charge of the situation. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur of fever and pain. Frank drove carefully but quickly, his truck's heater turned up full blast while Earl shivered in the passenger seat despite the warmth. The movement of the vehicle sent jolts of pain through his infected leg, and Earl found himself gripping the door handle to keep from crying out. "Almost there," Frank said softly, glancing over at his passenger with obvious concern. Dorothy's good friends with one of the nurses in the emergency room. Julie Morrison used to be Julie Patterson before she got married. "She'd take good care of you." The name meant nothing to Earl in his fevered state, just another detail in a day that had already spiraled far beyond his control. He closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for what was coming. The questions, the examinations, the bills that would follow him for years to come. At 67, he was about to learn that sometimes survival mattered more than pride, and that independence was a luxury he could no longer afford. The emergency room at Mercy General Hospital buzzed with the controlled chaos that Earl remembered from Martha's final months. Fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh relief, and the smell of antiseptic couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of fear and illness that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. Earl sat in a wheelchair that Frank had insisted upon, his fever making the bright lights feel like needles driven directly into his skull. Dorothy Kowalski had arrived ahead of them, her round face creased with worry as she spoke in hushed tones to a woman in navy blue scrubs behind the registration desk. Earl recognized the efficiency of small-town networks at work, Dorothy knowing someone who knew someone, favors called in and relationships leveraged to ensure that Earl received prompt attention despite the Sunday afternoon crowd. "Earl Whitcomb?" A voice called from the triage area, and Earl looked up to see a woman approaching with a clipboard and a professionally warm smile. She was perhaps 40 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of dealing with medical emergencies. Her name tag read Julie Morrison, RN. Something about her face seemed familiar, though Earl's fevered mind struggled to place where he might have seen her before. The name Morrison didn't ring any bells, but there was something about her eyes green, with flecks of gold that stirred a memory he couldn't quite grasp. "I'm Julie," she said, kneeling beside his wheelchair so they could speak at eye level. "Mrs. Kowalski says you're having some trouble with a leg injury. How long has this been going on?" Earl tried to focus through the fog of fever and pain. Up close, Julie's face was definitely familiar, though he still couldn't place where he knew her from. "Few days," he managed, his voice hoarse and weak. "Nothing serious." Julie's experienced eye was already assessing him, taking in the flush of fever, the way he favored his left leg, and the slight tremor in his hands that suggested his body was fighting a significant infection. "Let's get you into a room where we can take a proper look," she said, standing and beginning to push his wheelchair toward the treatment area. The examination room was small and sterile, with equipment that Earl didn't recognize mounted on the front and on walls. Julie helped him transfer from the wheelchair to the examination table, a process that left him breathing heavily and dizzy from the effort. The simple act of moving had become a monumental task, evidence of how much the infection had compromised his strength. "Now then," Julie said, washing her hands at a small sink, "tell me what happened to your leg." Earl found himself reluctant to explain the circumstances of his injury, partly because admitting to his makeshift medical care felt embarrassing, and partly because he was beginning to suspect that his duct tape solution might not meet with professional approval. "Had a fall in the barn," he said carefully. "Cut myself on an old hook. When was this?" "Thursday morning." Julie's hands stilled on the paper towel she was using to dry them. "Thursday morning? Today is Sunday, Mr. Whitcomb. That's 4 days ago. Have you had any medical treatment for this injury?" Earl could hear the carefully controlled concern in her voice, the professional tone that medical personnel used when they suspected a patient had made dangerous decisions about their care. "Took care of it myself," he said, lifting his chin slightly in a gesture of defiance that felt hollow given his current circumstances. "May I see the wound?" Julie asked, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. Earl hesitated for a moment, then slowly rolled up his pant leg to reveal the gauze-wrapped repair. The bandaging looked crude compared to the professional material surrounding them, and Earl could see Julie's expression grow more serious as she began to carefully unwrap the layers of gauze he'd applied. When she finally exposed the duct tape underneath, Julie's sharp intake of breath was audible in the small room. For a moment, she simply stared at the silver strips that held Earl's wound closed, her professional composure slipping just enough to reveal genuine shock at what she was seeing. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said slowly, "did you close this wound with duct tape?" "It was clean," Earl said defensively. "I cleaned it real good with antiseptic before You stitched yourself up with duct tape." Julie interrupted, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and forced it back to professional calm. "A 4-inch laceration, and you used duct tape instead of seeking medical attention." Earl couldn't tell whether the emotion in her voice was anger, disbelief, or something else entirely. He watched as she carefully examined the edges of the tape, noting the signs of infection that had developed around the improvised closure. The red streaks were clearly visible now, angry lines that tracked up his leg like warnings written in his own skin. "The tape is actually holding quite well," Julie said, almost to herself. "But this level of infection, Mr. Whitcomb, why didn't you come to the hospital when this happened?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Earl wasn't sure he was ready to discuss with a stranger. How could he explain that the choice between proper medical care and financial ruin wasn't really a choice at all? How could he make her understand that for people like him, emergency rooms were places of last resort, to be avoided until survival itself was at stake? "Couldn't afford it," he said finally, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. Julie's expression softened slightly, and Earl caught a glimpse of something that looked like understanding in her green eyes. She worked in a rural hospital, he realized. She had probably seen this scenario before, people delaying treatment because they couldn't afford the bills that would follow. "Mr. Whitcomb, I need to ask you some questions about your symptoms," she said, pulling a small computer terminal closer to the examination table. "Have you been running a fever?" "Some," Earl admitted. "For how long? Couple days, maybe." Julie nodded, making notes on her computer. "Any nausea? Dizziness? Changes in appetite?" Earl answered her questions as honestly as he could, though the fever made it difficult to remember exactly when each symptom had started. As they talked, Julie continued her examination, checking his pulse and blood pressure, listening to his heart and lungs, and carefully palpating the area around his wound without disturbing the tape. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said when her examination was complete, "I'm going to be very direct with you. This infection is serious. The red streaking indicates that bacteria have entered your lymphatic system, and your fever suggests that your body is fighting a systemic infection. If this had gone on much longer without treatment—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Earl could fill in the blanks. He'd seen enough infected wounds on farm animals to know that some infections didn't stay localized, that they could spread through the bloodstream and cause damage far beyond the original injury site. "What happens now?" Earl asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We need to admit you," Julie said firmly. "This requires 4 antibiotics, probably for several days. We'll need to remove the tape, clean the wound properly, and likely put in proper sutures. Depending on how deep the infection has penetrated, you might need surgery to remove infected tissue." Each word felt like another financial blow to Earl's already precarious situation. Hospital admission, 4 antibiotics, surgery. The cost would be astronomical. He thought about the bills from Martha's treatment, the numbers that had seemed impossible even when they'd had insurance and modest savings. Now, with neither safety net available, the financial consequences of his infection would likely destroy what little security he had left. "I can't afford that," Earl said quietly. "I don't have insurance, and I can't—" "Mr. Whitcomb," Julie interrupted gently. "Right now we need to focus on treating this infection. The financial aspects can be worked out later, but delaying treatment at this point could have very serious consequences." As she spoke, Earl found himself studying her face more carefully, trying to place where he'd seen her before. There was something about her manner, a familiarity that went beyond their brief interaction. She treated him with a kindness that felt personal rather than strictly professional, as if she knew him from somewhere else. "Do I know you?" Earl asked suddenly. "You seem familiar." Julie paused in her note-taking, and for a moment, something that looked like sadness crossed her features. "I used to know your son," she said quietly. "Tommy and I dated for a while several years back, before he moved to Seattle." The pieces clicked into place in Earl's fevered mind. Julie Patterson, now Morrison, the nurse that Tommy had brought home for dinner a few times during his last year in town. She'd been younger then, fresh out of nursing school, with the same green eyes but longer hair and a shy smile that had reminded Earl of Martha at that age. Tommy had been serious about her, serious enough that Earl and Martha had begun to hope for grandchildren and family dinners and a reason for their son to stay in town. But Tommy had received a job offer in Seattle, an opportunity too good to pass up, and Julie had made it clear that she intended to stay near her family and build her career in their small community. The relationship had ended amicably, but sadly, another casualty of the economic forces that pulled young people away from rural areas towards cities with better opportunities. "Julie Patterson," Earl said, the memory bringing clarity despite his fever. "You came to dinner a few times. Martha liked you." "I liked her too," Julie said softly. "She was very kind to me. I was sorry to hear about her passing." They looked at each other for a moment, the shared memory of Martha creating a bridge across the years and circumstances that had brought them together in this sterile room. Earl remembered Julie as she'd been then earnest and caring, with a quick laugh and an obvious affection for Tommy that had made Martha start planning weddings in her head. "Small world," Earl murmured. "Very small," Julie agreed. "Which is why I'm not going to let you leave this hospital until we get this infection under control. Martha would never forgive me if I let something happen to you because you were too stubborn to accept help." Earl started to protest, to assert his right to make his own medical decisions, regardless of the financial consequences. But Julie held up a hand to stop him. "Mr. Whitcomb, Earl, I know you're worried about the money. I understand that better than you might think. But right now, We're not talking about elective surgery or routine care. We're talking about a life-threatening infection that needs immediate treatment. The hospital has programs for people in your situation, and we'll work something out. But first, we need to save your leg and possibly your life." The words hit Earl like a physical blow. Life-threatening. He'd known the infection was serious, but hearing it stated so bluntly by a medical professional made the reality impossible to ignore. His improvised repair, his stubborn refusal to seek help, his fear of medical bills, all of it suddenly seemed petty and foolish in the face of Julie's stark assessment. "How bad is it really?" Earl asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Julie's expression was gentle but honest. "Bad enough that if you'd waited another day or two, we might be having a very different conversation. The good news is that you're here now, and we know how to treat this. But Earl, this has to be a lesson about seeking help when you need it. Independence is admirable, but not when it puts your life at risk." The admission process felt like surrendering more than just his independence. It felt like acknowledging that the careful structure he'd built around his solitary life was fundamentally unsustainable. Earl found himself in a hospital bed on the second floor, attached to an IV drip that delivered antibiotics directly into his bloodstream while monitors tracked his vital signs with electronic precision. The bed was more comfortable than his own at home, but the unfamiliar sounds and smells of the hospital made sleep elusive despite his exhaustion. Julie had stayed past the end of her shift to ensure Earl was properly settled, a kindness that went beyond professional duty. She'd explained the treatment plan in terms that respected his intelligence while making the medical necessity clear. Several days of intensive antibiotic therapy, surgical cleaning of the wound if the infection didn't respond quickly enough, and careful monitoring for signs that the infection might have spread beyond the initial site. Dr. Harrison, the attending physician, was a competent man in his 50s who treated Earl with professional courtesy but obvious disapproval of his self-treatment methods. He'd removed the duct tape with careful precision, revealing a wound that was deeper and more infected than Earl had realized. The sight of his own flesh, angry and swollen beneath the improvised repair, had been sobering evidence of how close he'd come to serious complications. The tape actually prevented proper drainage, Dr. Harrison had explained, while cleaning the wound. Infections need air circulation and the ability to expel contaminated material. By sealing it so completely, you created an ideal environment for bacterial growth. Earl had nodded silently, feeling foolish and reckless in a way that cut deeper than physical pain. He'd spent a lifetime solving problems with practical solutions, but this time his practical knowledge had been insufficient, and his improvised repair had nearly caused more harm than good. Now, as evening settled over the hospital, Earl lay in his bed and tried to process the rapid changes that had transformed his day. This morning, he'd been in his own kitchen, struggling to maintain the fiction that he could handle his medical problems alone. Tonight, he was surrounded by the sophisticated machinery of modern medicine, his body fighting an infection with the help of drugs that cost more per dose than he typically spent on groceries in a week. The financial implications haunted him despite Julie's reassurances about hospital programs for indigent patients. Earl had seen those programs in action during Martha's illness-complicated paperwork. Means testing and bureaucratic delays that often left families struggling to understand what they would ultimately owe. Even with assistance, the bills would be substantial, another burden to add to the collection that already made his chest tight whenever he thought about money. A soft knock on his door interrupted his brooding, and Earl looked up to see Julie entering with a cup of coffee and a folder tucked under her arm. She'd changed out of her scrubs into civilian clothes jeans and a soft green sweater that matched her eyes, but she still moved with the purposeful efficiency that marked her as medical personnel. "Thought you might like some real coffee," she said, offering him the cup. Hospital coffee is notorious for being terrible, but the cafeteria actually makes a decent pot if you know who to ask. Earl accepted the coffee gratefully, surprised by how much the simple gesture meant to him. The warmth of the cup in his hands and the familiar smell of properly brewed coffee made the sterile hospital room feel slightly more human. "You didn't have to come back," Earl said. "I'm sure you have better things to do with your evening than babysit a stubborn old man." Julie pulled the visitor's chair closer to his bed and settled into it with the comfortable ease of someone accustomed to long conversations in hospital rooms. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about a few things. And I brought some paperwork that might help with your financial concerns." She opened the folder and withdrew several forms, spreading them on the bedside table where Earl could see them. The documents looked official and complicated, filled with the dense text and fine print that characterized bureaucratic paperwork. "The hospital has a charity care program," Julie explained. "It's designed for people in exactly your situation, folks, who need medical care, but don't have insurance or significant assets. Based on what you've told me about your income and circumstances, you should qualify for substantial assistance, possibly even complete coverage of your treatment costs." Earl studied the forms with skeptical eyes. He'd learned to be wary of promises that seemed too good to be true, especially when they came from institutions that had profit motives. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Julie said firmly. "Well, except for paperwork. Lots of paperwork. You'll need to document your income, assets, and expenses. They'll want bank statements, tax returns, proof of your Social Security payments. It's intrusive and annoying, but it's legitimate help. And if they decide I don't qualify?" Julie's expression grew more serious. "Then we'll figure out payment plans, negotiate with the billing department, and explore other options." "Earl, I've worked here for 8 years, and I've never seen anyone turned away from necessary medical care because they couldn't pay. The billing might be complicated and stressful, but the treatment happens regardless." Earl sipped his coffee and considered Julie's words. The cynical part of him wondered if she was being naively optimistic about the hospital's generosity, but her obvious sincerity and professional experience carried weight. More importantly, he was beginning to realize that his choices had narrowed to accepting help or facing consequences that could be far worse than financial hardship. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Julie continued, her tone becoming more personal. "I called Tommy." Earl's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "You called my son?" "I thought he should know about your condition. He's your emergency contact, and this is definitely an emergency situation." "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you'd injured yourself, delayed seeking treatment, and developed a serious infection that required hospitalization." Julie's voice was gentle but firm. "He was upset, Earl. Not angry, worried. He wants to fly out here as soon as he can arrange time off work." Earl set down his coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from the fever or emotional stress, he couldn't tell. The thought of Tommy dropping everything to rush to his bedside filled him with a complex mixture of gratitude and shame. His son had his own life to live, his own responsibilities and commitments. The last thing Earl wanted was to become a burden that pulled Tommy away from the success he'd worked so hard to achieve. "Tell him not to come," Earl said quietly. "Tell him I'm fine and there's no need for him to—" "I'm not telling him anything of the sort," Julie interrupted. "You're his father, and he loves you. He has every right to be here. And frankly, you could use the support. I don't want to be a burden to him." Julie studied Earl's face for a moment, and he could see something that looked like understanding in her expression. "Can I tell you something about Tommy? Something I learned when we were dating?" Earl nodded, curious despite his emotional turmoil. "He used to talk about you and Martha all the time, about how you taught him to work with his hands, how you could fix anything that broke, How you took care of the farm and your family without ever complaining about the hard work or the long hours. Julie's voice grew softer. He was proud of you, Earl. Proud of your independence and your practical knowledge and your ability to solve problems. But he was also worried that you were too stubborn to ask for help when you needed it. The words hit Earl like a physical blow, confirming fears he'd carried for years about his relationship with his son. Tommy's move to Seattle hadn't just been about career opportunities. It had also been about escaping the small-town limitations that Earl represented. The old-fashioned approaches that seemed increasingly irrelevant in a modern world. He thinks. I'm a stubborn old fool, Earl said. He thinks you're a proud man who's afraid that accepting help means admitting weakness, Julie corrected. There's a difference. And Earl, he's not wrong about the stubborn part, but he's also not right about the weakness. Knowing when to ask for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Earl processing Julie's words while she waited patiently for him to respond. Outside his window, the lights of the small town stretched into the darkness, each illuminated window representing a life being lived, problems being solved, families dealing with their own challenges and complications. I've been taking care of myself for so long, Earl said finally. Since Martha died, since Tommy moved away, since I realized that getting old means losing the people and things that make life meaningful. Independence was all I had left. Independence doesn't have to mean isolation, Julie said gently. You can still take care of yourself, still live in your own home, still make your own decisions. But you can also accept help when you need it. Let people who care about you be part of your life. People like you? Julie smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the young woman who'd sat at Earl's kitchen table years ago, laughing at something Tommy had said while Martha bustled around preparing dinner. People like me, and Frank and Dorothy. And Tommy, even though he's far away. You have more support than you realize, Earl. You just have to be willing to accept it. A nurse appeared in the doorway to check Earl's and vital signs, a routine procedure that reminded him of where he was and why he was there. As the nurse worked efficiently around his bed, Earl found himself thinking about the interconnected nature of the help he was receiving. Julie's professional expertise, combined with her personal knowledge of his family. Frank and Dorothy's neighborhood concern, expressed through practical assistance and emotional support. Tommy's love, complicated by distance and different life choices, but real nonetheless. After the nurse left, Julie gathered up the charity care paperwork and placed it within Earl's reach. I'll help you fill these out tomorrow, she said. It's not as complicated as it looks, and I know the people in the financial office who process these applications. Why are you doing this? Earl asked. Why go to all this trouble for someone who made such poor decisions about his own care? Julie considered the question for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Partly because I'm a nurse, and helping people is what I do. Partly because I remember how kind you and Martha were to me when I was dating Tommy. How you made me feel like part of the family, even though things didn't work out between us. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. But mostly because I see this happen too often. Good people making dangerous choices because they're afraid of burdening others or can't afford proper care. If I can help prevent that, even in one case, then maybe I've made a difference. Earl felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained over his emotions since Martha's death. For the first time in months, he felt genuinely cared for by someone outside his immediate family, reminded that he was part of a community that valued his well-being beyond his ability to contribute or pay his own way. Thank you, he said simply, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. Julie stood and prepared to leave, but she paused at the door to deliver one final thought. Earl, when Tommy gets here, and he will get here, try to remember that he's not coming because he thinks you can't take care of yourself. He's coming because he loves you and wants to be sure you're okay. There's a difference, and it matters. After she left, Earl lay in his hospital bed and watched the lights of his hometown through the window. For the first time since his accident. In the barn, he allowed himself to hope that he might emerge from this crisis not just physically healed, but reconnected to the people and community that could help make his remaining years meaningful rather than merely endured. Earl woke Tuesday morning to the sound of familiar voices in the hallway outside his room. The antibiotics had begun their work, bringing his fever down and clearing some of the fog from his thoughts. But the voices he was hearing seemed impossible. One belonged to Julie, which made sense since she'd been checking on him regularly despite working different shifts. The other voice, however, belonged to his son Tommy 2 days earlier than anyone had expected him to arrive. Stubborn as hell, just like always, Tommy was saying, his voice carrying the mixture of affection and frustration that Earl remembered from their phone conversations. I should have known something like this would happen. He's been living out there alone for 3 years, refusing help, refusing to move somewhere safer. He's been managing quite well, actually, Julie replied, her tone diplomatically neutral. This was an accident, Tommy. It could have happened to anyone. But anyone else would have gone to the hospital immediately, instead of trying to fix themselves with duct tape. Tommy shot back. That's pure dad convinced he can solve any problem with something from his toolbox. Earl closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, not ready to face the complicated emotions that his son's unexpected arrival had stirred up. Tommy's voice sounded older, more assured than Earl remembered, carrying the confidence that came from professional success and urban sophistication. There was also an edge of judgment in his tone that made Earl's chest tighten with familiar defensiveness. Mr. Whitcomb? Julie's voice was gentle as she entered the room. Your son is here to see you. Earl opened his eyes and turned toward the door, where Tommy stood in clothes that probably cost more than Earl spent on groceries in 2 months. His son had inherited Martha's height and lean build, but his face showed the stress lines that came from demanding work and city living. At 35, Tommy looked successful and prosperous, everything that Earl had hoped for when his son had left for college 20 years ago. Hello, Tommy, Earl said quietly. Dad. Tommy approached the bed cautiously, as if he wasn't sure what to expect from his father's current condition. How are you feeling? Better than yesterday, Earl replied honestly. The antibiotics are helping. Tommy pulled the visitor's chair closer to the bed and sat down heavily, his designer clothes looking out of place in the utilitarian hospital environment. Dad, what were you thinking? Duct tape on a wound that needed stitches? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with years of unspoken tensions about Earl's stubborn independence and Tommy's frustrated concern. Earl could see the genuine worry in his son's eyes, but he could also see the judgment, the urban sophistication that viewed his father's practical solutions as primitive and potentially dangerous. I was thinking I couldn't afford a hospital. Bill, Earl said simply. Tommy's expression shifted, surprise replacing some of the exasperation. Dad, if you needed money for medical care, you should have called me. I could have helped. I don't want to be a burden to you, son. You've got your own life to live. A burden? Tommy's voice rose slightly, causing Julie to glance over from where she was checking Earl's chart. Dad, you're my father. Taking care of family isn't a burden, is what people do for each other. Earl studied his son's face, seeing echoes of Martha in the set of his jaw and the way his eyes flashed when he was upset. Tommy had always been passionate about fairness and doing the right thing, qualities that had served him well in his professional life, but sometimes made family relationships more complicated than they needed to be. I didn't want to take you away from your important work, Earl said, gesturing toward Tommy's expensive suit. You've built a good life out there, I didn't want to be the old man who pulled you back into small-town problems." Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing his father's words. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more thoughtful. "Dad, do you really think my work is more important than your health? More important than making sure you're okay?" Before Earl could answer, Julie cleared her throat diplomatically. "I'll give you two some privacy to talk," she said, heading toward the door. "Earl, Dr. Harrison will be making rounds in about an hour if you have any questions about your treatment." Plan. After Julie left, father and son sat in awkward silence, each waiting for the other to bridge the gap that had grown between them over the years. Earl could hear the sounds of the hospital around them, the distant murmur of conversations, the soft beeping of monitors, the efficient footsteps of medical staff moving through their daily routines. "Tommy," Earl said finally, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without getting upset." Tommy nodded, his expression wary but attentive. "Your mother and I always wanted you to have opportunities we never had. When you got that scholarship to college, when you landed that job in Seattle, when you started climbing the ladder in your company, we were proud. Prouder than you could possibly know." Earl paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But success like yours comes with obligations, with responsibilities to the people who depend on you. I didn't want to be the anchor that held you back, or the guilt that made you choose between your career and your old man's problems." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands before looking back at his father. "Dad, can I tell you something? Something I should have said years ago?" Earl nodded. "I didn't move to Seattle just for the job opportunities. I moved because I was afraid of becoming you." The words hit Earl like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about how his son viewed his life choices. He felt his face flush with a mixture of hurt and anger, but Tommy held up a hand to stop him from responding. "Wait, let me finish. I was afraid of becoming you because you made it look so easy taking care of Mom, managing the farm, solving every problem that came up, without ever complaining or asking for help. I was afraid I wasn't strong enough to handle that kind of responsibility, that I'd fail at the things that mattered most." Tommy's voice grew softer, more emotional. "I ran away to a place where success was measured in quarterly reports and performance reviews, where problems had clear solutions and success was quantifiable. It felt safer than trying to live up to the example you and Mom set." Earl stared at his son, struggling to process this unexpected revelation. "I thought you were embarrassed. By us, by the small-town life, the farm, the simple way we did things." "Embarrassed?" Tommy shook his head emphatically. "Dad, I've spent 15 years trying to find work that felt as meaningful as what you did every day. You fed your family, took care of your land, helped your neighbors, and made an honest living with your hands. Do you know how rare that is? How many people in my world would kill for that kind of purpose?" The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Julie entered carrying a folder and wearing the expression of someone who had news to deliver. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I have the results of your latest blood work, Earl, and Dr. Harrison asked me to discuss them with you. Good news or bad news?" Earl asked, noting the careful neutrality in Julie's expression. "Mixed news," Julie replied, pulling up a chair so she could sit at Earl's eye level. "The good news is that the antibiotics are working. Your white blood cell count is coming down, and the infection markers are improving significantly. And the bad news?" Julie glanced at Tommy before answering. "The blood work also revealed something unexpected. Your kidney function isn't what it should be, Earl. The numbers suggest you've been developing chronic kidney disease, probably for several years." Earl felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Kidney disease? It's not uncommon in men your age, especially if there's been undiagnosed diabetes or high blood pressure, Julie explained gently. The good news is that it's manageable with proper medical care, dietary changes, and regular monitoring. But Earl, this is exactly the kind of condition that requires ongoing medical attention. Tommy leaned forward in his chair, his business-trained mind immediately grasping the implications. How long has this been developing? What would have happened if we hadn't discovered it now? Hard to say exactly, Julie replied. But chronic kidney disease is progressive. Without treatment, it eventually leads to kidney failure, which requires dialysis or transplantation. Earl looked from Julie to Tommy, seeing his own shock reflected in his son's face. The revelation reframed everything about his current situation. His infection hadn't just been an isolated medical emergency caused by his stubborn self-treatment. It had been the accidental discovery of a much more serious underlying condition that could have remained hidden until it was too late to treat effectively. So the duct tape incident, Earl said slowly. It might have saved my life in a way I never intended. That's one way to look at it, Julie agreed. Sometimes medical emergencies reveal problems that might otherwise have gone undetected until they became life-threatening. Tommy sat back in his chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that reminded Earl powerfully of Martha when she was processing difficult news. Dad, this changes everything. You can't live alone on the farm with a condition like this. You need regular medical monitoring, probably medication, dietary supervision. Now hold on, Earl interrupted, feeling the familiar surge of defensive independence. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Julie said it was manageable with proper care. Not that I needed to give up my home and move to some assisted living facility. But Dad, Tommy, Julie interjected diplomatically, why don't we focus on getting your father's infection completely cleared up first? Then we can work with his primary care physician to develop a long-term management plan for the kidney disease. There are lots of options between complete independence and assisted living. Earl shot Julie a grateful look, appreciating her intervention. Before his conversation with Tommy could spiral into the same old arguments about independence versus safety. But even as he felt relieved by her diplomatic response, Earl knew that this new diagnosis had fundamentally altered his situation. He was no longer just a stubborn old man who'd made poor choices about treating a minor injury. He was now a patient with a chronic condition that would require ongoing medical supervision, regular doctor visits, prescription medications, and careful monitoring of his diet and lifestyle. The very independence he'd been fighting to preserve had been revealed as potentially life-threatening neglect of his own health. That the irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to avoid the financial burden of treating his leg wound, he'd accidentally discovered a condition that would require far more extensive and expensive medical care than a few stitches and antibiotics would have cost. His duct tape solution hadn't just been medically inadvisable. It had been the unlikely catalyst for discovering that his approach to healthcare was fundamentally unsustainable. As he looked at Tommy's worried face and Julie's professionally compassionate expression, Earl realized that the conversation they were about to have wouldn't just be about his immediate medical needs. It would be about reimagining what independence could look like for a man whose body was requiring him to accept realities he'd spent years trying to avoid. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of medical consultations, family discussions, and decisions that Earl had never imagined he would need to make. Dr. Harrison had referred him to a nephrologist, a kidney specialist, who explained the complexities of chronic kidney disease with the patient thoroughness of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing diagnoses to people who had no medical background. Dr. Sarah Chun was a small, precise woman in her 40s who spoke with the careful clarity of someone who understood that medical jargon could be terrifying to patients already overwhelmed by their circumstances. She'd reviewed Earl's blood work, ordered additional tests, and delivered her assessment with a mixture of professional honesty and gentle encouragement. Your kidney function is operating at about 60% of normal, she'd explained, using diagrams and charts to illustrate what that meant in practical terms. That places you in stage 3, a chronic kidney disease, which is moderate but manageable with proper care. Earl had listened with growing anxiety as Dr. Chen outlined the treatment requirements: regular blood work every 3 months, careful monitoring of blood pressure and blood sugar, dietary restrictions that would eliminate many of his favorite foods, and medications that would need to be taken precisely as prescribed. The complexity of managing his condition felt overwhelming to a man who had prided himself on the simplicity of his daily routines. Tommy had filled a legal pad with notes during the consultation, asking detailed questions about progression rates, treatment options, and long-term prognosis with the systematic approach he brought to business problems. Earl could see his son's mind working, analyzing the information and developing strategies for managing this new reality. "What happens if the disease progresses?" Tommy had asked. "In some patients, chronic kidney disease stabilizes and remains manageable for many years," Dr. Chun had replied. "In others, it progresses toward end-stage renal disease, which would require dialysis or kidney transplantation. The goal of treatment is to slow progression and maintain quality of life for as long as possible." After Dr. Chum left, Earl and Tommy sat in silence for several minutes, each processing the magnitude of what they'd learned. The infection that had brought Earl to the hospital was nearly cleared, his leg was healing well, and he would be discharged within a day or two. But the kidney disease diagnosis had transformed a temporary medical crisis into a permanent change in how Earl would need to approach his health and his future. "Dad," Tommy said finally, "we need to talk about practical arrangements. This condition requires regular medical monitoring, and you're living 20 minutes from town with no reliable transportation." Earl had been dreading this conversation since Dr. Chun's diagnosis. He could see the logic in Tommy's concern, could understand why his son would view the farm as an obstacle to proper medical care, rather than the source of meaning and independence that it represented to Earl. "I'm not leaving the farm," Earl said quietly but firmly. "I'm not asking you to leave the farm," Tommy replied, his voice carefully controlled. "But we need to make some changes. You need reliable transportation to get to medical appointments. You need a way to communicate if there's an emergency. And honestly, Dad, you need someone checking on you regularly to make sure you're following your treatment plan." Earl bristled at the implication that he couldn't be trusted to take care of himself, but he forced himself to consider Tommy's words objectively. The kidney disease required a level of medical compliance that went far beyond his previous approach to health care. Missing appointments or failing to take medications could have serious consequences, and his track record of avoiding medical care didn't inspire confidence in his ability to manage a chronic condition. "What are you suggesting?" Earl asked. Tommy consulted his legal pad, where he'd apparently been developing a comprehensive plan for addressing Earl's medical needs. "First, we get you a reliable vehicle. Your truck is 20 years old and breaks down regularly. Second, we install a medical alert system in the house so you can call for help if there's an emergency. Third, we arrange for regular check-ins from home health services or visiting nurses." Each suggestion felt like another step toward the kind of supervised living that Earl had been trying to avoid, but he found himself unable to argue with the practical necessity of Tommy's proposals. The kidney disease had changed the calculation of risk versus independence, making some form of external support essential rather than optional. "And fourth," Tommy continued, "I think I should move back." The words hit Earl like a physical blow. "Move back?" "Tommy, you can't. Your career, your life in Seattle." "My career will survive," Tommy said firmly. "I've been thinking about this for the past 2 days, and it makes sense from every angle. I can work remotely most of the time, fly out for important meetings when necessary. The cost of living here is a fraction of what I pay in Seattle, So, financially, it's actually beneficial. Earl stared at his son, seeing determination in Tommy's expression that reminded him powerfully of Martha when she'd made up her mind about something. You're talking about giving up everything you've built to come back and babysit your old man. I'm talking about coming home, Tommy corrected. Dad, I've spent 15 years building a career that pays well, but doesn't mean much to me. I sit in meetings all day talking about profit margins and market share, and I go home to an empty apartment in a city where I don't really have friends, just professional contacts. Tommy paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. You know what I realized when Julie called to tell me you were in the hospital? I realized that I was more afraid of losing you than I was of leaving my job. That tells me something important about what actually matters to me. Earl felt tears prick in his eyes, an emotional response that surprised him with its intensity. The prospect of having Tommy nearby, of rebuilding the relationship that distance and time had attenuated, was almost overwhelming in its appeal. But the guilt of potentially derailing his son's career was equally powerful. Tommy, you don't understand what you'd be giving up, Earl said. Small towns don't have the opportunities you've gotten used to. The pace is different. The ambitions are smaller. And once you've been away for 15 years... Dad, Tommy interrupted. Gently, I know exactly what I'd be giving up, and I know exactly what I'd be gaining. I'd be giving up a job that pays well but doesn't fulfill me, and I'd be gaining the chance to help take care of the man who taught me everything important I know about character and responsibility. Their conversation was interrupted by Julie's arrival with Earl's discharge paperwork and a folder full of information about managing chronic kidney disease. She'd been instrumental in coordinating Earl's transition from acute care to long-term management, serving as both medical advocate and family friend during the complicated process of arranging his ongoing care. How are you feeling about going home? Julie asked as she reviewed the discharge instructions with Earl. Nervous, Earl admitted. Everything feels different now. The house, the farm, the daily routine, it all feels less secure knowing that my body isn't as reliable as I thought it was. Julie nodded understandingly. That's completely normal. A chronic disease diagnosis changes how you think about your future, your independence, your mortality. But Earl, you're going to be okay. The kidney disease is manageable. You have good medical support, and you have family who care about you. She glanced at Tommy before continuing. Speaking of family, I understand there might be some changes in your living situation. Tommy thinks he wants to move back, Earl said, still struggling to believe that his son would seriously consider such a major life change. I don't think I want to move back, Tommy corrected. I've decided to move back. I've already contacted my boss about transitioning to remote work, and I've started looking at apartments in town. Julie smiled, and Earl could see genuine happiness in her expression. That's wonderful news. For both of you and for the community. We've lost too many young people to the cities over the years. It feels like the right decision, Tommy said. It's taken me a long time to realize that success isn't just about climbing the corporate ladder. Sometimes it's about being where you're needed most. Earl looked at his son and saw echoes of the boy who had helped with farm chores, learned to drive in the pasture behind the barn, and left for college with tears in his eyes and promises to visit often. Tommy had become a successful man, but he'd also remained someone who understood the value of family and responsibility. Are you sure about this? Earl asked one more time. Really sure? I'm sure, Tommy replied without hesitation. Dad, I've spent 15 years building a life that looked good on paper, but felt empty in reality. This feels like a chance to build something that actually matters. Julie finished organizing Earl's discharge paperwork and medication instructions, creating a comprehensive system for managing his new medical routine. Earl, I want you to know that I'll be checking on you regularly. Chronic kidney disease patients need advocates, people who understand the medical system and can help navigate the complexities of ongoing care. "You don't have to," Earl began. But Julie held up a hand to stop him. "I want to," she said firmly. "You and Martha were kind to me when I was young and uncertain about my future. Now I'm in a position to return that kindness, and I'm going to do exactly that." As Earl prepared to leave the hospital that had been his home for the past week, he realized that his life was about to change in ways that went far beyond managing a chronic medical condition. His son was coming home, bringing with him the possibility of rebuilding a relationship that had been strained by distance and different life choices. Julie had appointed herself as his medical advocate and friend, providing both professional expertise and personal support. The farm that had felt increasingly isolated and burdensome was about to become the center of a renewed sense of family and community. Earl's stubborn insistence on complete independence had been replaced by an acceptance of interdependence, the recognition that meaningful relationships required both giving and receiving help. As Tommy pushed his wheelchair toward the hospital exit, Earl found himself looking forward rather than backward for the first time in years. The kidney disease diagnosis had been frightening, but it had also served as a catalyst for changes that might make his remaining years richer and more connected than the solitary existence he'd been enduring since Martha's death. The duct tape solution that had seemed so practical in his barn now seemed like a metaphor for his entire approach to aging, an attempt to hold things together with inadequate tools rather than seeking proper help when it was needed. But sometimes, Earl reflected, even our worst decisions could lead to unexpected benefits, and his medical emergency had revealed possibilities for his future that he never could have imagined while sitting alone in his farmhouse, convinced that independence and isolation were the same thing. The drive home from the hospital felt both familiar and foreign to Earl, as if he were seeing his own life through new eyes. Tommy drove Earl's old pickup truck with careful attention to every bump and pothole, treating his father like fragile cargo that needed gentle handling. The November landscape looked stark and beautiful in the afternoon sunlight, with bare trees casting long shadows across fields that had gone dormant for the winter. As they turned into the gravel driveway that led to the farmhouse, Earl felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. This was home, the place where he built a life with Martha and raised his son. But it was also the scene of his accident and the beginning of a medical crisis that had fundamentally changed his understanding of his own mortality. The house looked exactly as he'd left it a week ago, but Earl's perspective had shifted so dramatically that everything seemed different. The front porch steps that he climbed thousands of times now looked potentially treacherous for someone whose balance might be compromised by medication. The distance from the house to the barn, which had always seemed like a pleasant walk, now appeared daunting for a man who needed to conserve energy for medical appointments and health management. "Home sweet home," Tommy said as he parked the truck. But Earl could hear the careful assessment in his son's voice as he surveyed the property with new eyes. Inside the farmhouse, the accumulated dust and stale air of a week's absence made the space feel abandoned rather than lived in. Earl moved slowly through the familiar rooms, noting details that his pre-diagnosis self would have taken for granted. The steep stairs to the second floor, the distance from the kitchen to the bathroom, the isolation from neighbors who might notice if something went wrong. Tommy began opening windows to air out the house while Earl settled into his recliner with the bag of medications that represented his new daily routine. The pill bottles looked foreign and complicated, each with specific timing requirements and potential side effects that he would need to monitor carefully. "Dad," Tommy said, sitting down on the couch where he could face Earl directly, "we need to have a serious conversation about what happens next." Earl looked at his son and saw the determined expression that meant Tommy had been thinking carefully about their situation and had reached conclusions that Earl might not want to hear. "I'm listening. I've been thinking about the practical realities of managing your condition out here," Tommy began. consulting the notes he'd taken during various medical consultations. The kidney disease requires blood work every 3 months, regular doctor visits, careful medication management, and dietary monitoring. All of that is doable, but it requires a level of organization and consistency that you don't think I'm capable of. Earl interrupted, feeling the familiar bristle of defensive independence. That would be challenging for anyone, Tommy corrected gently. Dad, this isn't about your competence or intelligence. It's about the complexity of managing a chronic condition while living alone in a rural area with limited transportation and no immediate backup if something goes wrong. Earl knew that Tommy was right, but accepting that truth felt like admitting defeat in a battle he'd been fighting since Martha's death. The farmhouse represented more than just shelter. It was the physical embodiment of his independence, his connection to Martha's memory, and his sense of identity as a man who could take care of himself. "What are you proposing?" Earl asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Tommy took a deep breath before responding. "I think you should consider moving to town. There's a nice senior community about 10 minutes from the hospital, with medical staff on call and transportation services for appointments. You'd have your own apartment, but you'd also have support when you need it." The words hit Earl like a physical blow. Senior community. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what Tommy was really suggesting, that Earl should give up his home, his independence, and his connection to the life he'd built with Martha in exchange for the safety and convenience of institutional care. "No," Earl said flatly. "Absolutely not. Dad, just think about it." "I said no, Tommy." Earl's voice carried a firmness that surprised both of them. "I'm not leaving this house to go live in some facility where strangers decide. When I eat, and when I sleep, and when I'm allowed to have visitors." Tommy leaned forward, his expression earnest and worried. "It wouldn't be like that. These places are designed for people who want to maintain their independence while having access to help when they need it. You'd have your own space, your own schedule, your own decisions about how to spend your time. In a building full of sick old people waiting to die," Earl shot back. "Tommy, I know you mean well, but I'm not ready to give up on living my own life." They stared at each other across the living room, the air thick with unspoken tensions about aging, independence, and the responsibilities that adult children owe their parents. Earl could see the love and worry in Tommy's eyes, but he could also see the practical calculation that viewed Earl's attachment to the farm as an obstacle to proper medical care. "Dad," Tommy said quietly, "what if something happens? What if you fall again, or have a medical emergency, or miss taking your medications? Who's going to know? Who's going to help?" The questions hung in the air between them, giving voice to fears that Earl had been trying not to think about since his diagnosis. The reality was that Tommy's concerns were legitimate. Living alone with a chronic medical condition carried risks that couldn't be dismissed through stubborn determination. But Earl also knew that moving to a senior community would be a form of slow death, a surrender of everything that made his life meaningful in exchange for safety and convenience. The farmhouse might be isolated and potentially dangerous, but it was also the repository of his memories, his achievements, and his sense of identity. "Tommy," Earl said finally, "I understand your concerns, and I appreciate that they come from love. But I need you to understand something too. This house, this farm, they're not just property to me. They're the place where your mother and I built our life together. Every room has memories. Every improvement represents something we accomplished together." Earl paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "When I sit in the kitchen in the morning, I can still feel her presence. When I work in the garden, I'm continuing something we started together. If I move to some sterile apartment in town, I lose all of that." Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing his father's words. Earl could see the internal struggle playing out on his son's face, the conflict between practical concerns about safety and emotional understanding of what the farm meant to Earl. Then we find another way, Tommy said finally. If you're determined to stay here, then we make it work. But Dad, that means accepting help. Real help. Not just token gestures that make us feel better while leaving you essentially alone with a serious medical condition. Earl felt a surge of gratitude toward his son, mixed with apprehension about what real help might entail. What did you have in mind? Tommy consulted his notes again, the business-trained part of his mind organizing solutions with systematic efficiency. First, we install a comprehensive medical alert system, not just a panic button, but monitors that track your vital signs and can detect falls or other emergencies automatically. Second, we arrange for daily check-ins from home health services. Third, we set up a medication management system that ensures you're taking everything on schedule. Each suggestion represented another layer of supervision and external intervention. But Earl found himself less resistant than he'd expected. Tommy wasn't proposing to take away his independence. He was proposing to create a safety net that would allow Earl to maintain his independence while managing the risks that came with his medical condition. And fourth, Tommy continued, I move into the apartment above the garage. It's been empty since we used it for storage, but it could be converted into a decent living space. I'd be close enough to help if there's an emergency, but far enough away that we're not living in each other's pockets. Earl looked toward the window that faced the old garage, imagining Tommy living in the space that had once housed farm equipment and seasonal storage. The apartment had been Martha's idea, a way to provide privacy for visiting relatives or, someday, grandchildren who might want to spend summers on the farm. Thought the irony wasn't lost on Earl that the space intended for future generations was now being proposed as housing for his son's return to take care of him. But there was also something deeply satisfying about the prospect of having Tommy nearby, of rebuilding the daily connection that distance and time had eroded. You've really thought this through, Earl said. I've thought about little else since Dr. Chun's diagnosis, Tommy admitted. Dad, I spent 15 years running away from this place because I was afraid of the responsibilities that came with staying. Now I'm realizing that the responsibilities I was afraid of are actually the things that make life meaningful. Earl studied his son's face, seeing determination mixed with something that looked like peace. Tommy had made his decision not from obligation or guilt, but from a genuine desire to be part of his father's life during what might be their remaining years together. Are you sure about giving up your career in Seattle? Earl asked one more time. I'm not giving up my career, Tommy corrected. I'm changing how I practice it. Dad, I can do most of my work from anywhere with a good internet connection. The technology exists to maintain my professional relationships while living wherever I choose to live. Earl felt something shift inside. Him, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained since Martha's death. For 3 years, he'd been trying to preserve their shared life by freezing it in place, maintaining the house and farm exactly as they'd been when she was alive. But Tommy's return represented the possibility of creating something new while honoring what had come before. All right, Earl said, the word coming out with more conviction than he'd expected. Let's try it your way. The simple statement seemed to release tension that had been building between them for years, not just during the past week of medical crisis. Tommy's face brightened with relief and something that looked like joy, and Earl realized how much his acceptance meant to his son. Over the next hour, they walked through the farmhouse together, seeing it through new eyes as they planned. Modifications that would make it suitable for someone managing a chronic medical condition. Tommy took notes on his phone, photographing areas that would need attention and sketching rough plans for the changes they would need to implement. The kitchen required the most significant modifications. Earl's current system of keeping medications in a shoebox on the counter would need to be replaced with a proper medication management system. Something with timers and compartments that would ensure he took the right pills at the right times. The old rotary phone that had served the house for 15 years would be supplemented with a modern cordless system that included medical alert capabilities. "We'll need to widen the doorway to the bathroom," Tommy noted, "and install grab bars in the shower. The stairs to the second floor should have a chairlift, just in case your mobility becomes limited." Each modification represented a concession to the reality of aging and illness, but Earl found himself less resistant than he'd expected. These weren't changes that would transform his home into an institution. They were practical improvements that would allow him to continue living independently while managing his health safely. The garage apartment posed a different set of challenges. The space had been used for storage for years, filled with the accumulated detritus of farm life old equipment. Seasonal decorations, boxes of items that were too useful to throw away, but not useful enough to keep in the house. Converting it into livable space would require significant work, but the bones of the structure were sound. It has its own entrance, electricity, and plumbing, Tommy observed as they climbed the stairs to examine the space. The windows are in good shape, and the floor just needs refinishing. With some insulation, drywall, and basic furnishings, it could be quite comfortable. Earl looked around the dusty space and tried to imagine his son living there, working remotely for his Seattle company while being available to help with medical emergencies and daily support. The arrangement would represent a fundamental shift in their relationship. Tommy moving from distant son to nearby caregiver and partner in managing Earl's health. "What about your social life?" Earl asked. "You're used to city amenities, restaurants, cultural events. Won't you be bored living out here in the middle of nowhere?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Dad, I've been living in Seattle for 15 years, and my social life consists mainly of professional networking events and the occasional dinner with colleagues. I spend most evenings alone in my apartment, working late or watching television." He gestured toward the window that looked out over the farm's familiar landscape. "At least here, if I'm going to be alone, I'll be alone somewhere that feels like home. And I won't really be alone. I'll be part of a community again, connected to people who've known me since I was a kid." Earl could hear the sincerity in Tommy's voice, but he also detected something else, a weariness with the urban lifestyle that had once seemed so appealing. His son had achieved the professional success that Earl and Martha had hoped for, but that success had come at the cost of meaningful relationships and connection to place. "And there's Julie," Tommy added quietly. Earl raised his eyebrows. "Julie? We've been talking while you were in the hospital. About old times, about what we've both been doing since I left, about what it might mean if I move back." Tommy's voice carried a note of cautious hope. "I don't know if there's still something there, but I'd like the chance to find out." Earl felt a surge of joy at this unexpected development. He'd always liked Julie, had been sorry when her relationship with Tommy had ended due to geographic incompatibility, rather than any fundamental problems between them. The possibility that Tommy's return might rekindle their romance added another layer of meaning to his decision to come home. "She never married," Earl said. "She's been Morrison for several years now, but that's her professional name. She never took a husband's name." "I know," Tommy replied. "We talked about that too. She said she's been waiting for the right person to come along, but the men in this area either stayed and never grew up, or left and never came back. And now one of them is coming back." "Now one of them is coming back," Tommy agreed. "Hopefully not too late." They spent the rest of the afternoon making practical plans for the changes that would need to be implemented. Tommy would return to Seattle for 2 weeks to arrange his transition to remote work, pack his belongings, and terminate his apartment lease. During that time, Earl would work with Julie to establish his medical care routine and begin the process of installing the safety equipment that would make living alone more secure. "I'm scared," Earl admitted as they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the oak tree that Martha had planted. I've been taking care of myself for so long that accepting help feels like admitting failure." "It's not failure, Dad," Tommy said gently. "It's adaptation. You're facing a new challenge and finding a way to meet it without giving up the things that matter most to you. That's not failure, that's wisdom." Earl considered his son's words, recognizing the truth in them despite his emotional resistance. The kidney disease had forced him to confront the reality that complete independence was an illusion, that everyone needed support systems and backup plans for when their own resources proved insufficient. "Your mother would have liked this arrangement," Earl said finally. "She always worried about what would happen to me if she died first. She would have been relieved to know that you were nearby, that I wouldn't have to face everything alone." "She would have been proud of you too," Tommy replied, "for being willing to accept help when you needed it, for finding a way to stay in the home you love while still taking care of your health." As darkness settled over the farm, Earl felt a sense of peace that had been absent from his life since Martha's death. The medical crisis that had begun with a simple fall in the barn had led to discoveries and decisions that would fundamentally improve his remaining years. His stubborn attempt to avoid medical bills had accidentally revealed a serious health condition, and his son's response to that crisis had created an opportunity for rebuilding their relationship. The duct tape that had seemed like such a practical solution to his injury now appeared as a symbol of his old approach to problems, trying to hold things together with inadequate tools rather than seeking proper help when it was needed. But even that misguided decision had led to positive outcomes, proving that sometimes our worst choices could create unexpected opportunities for growth and connection. "Tommy," Earl said as they prepared to go inside, "I want you to know that having you come home means more to me than I can express. Not just because of the practical help, but because it gives us a chance to be family again in a way we haven't been since you left for college." "I know, Dad," Tommy replied. "I've missed that too. More than I realized until I got the call that you were in the hospital." Earl looked out over the farm that had been his life's work, now transformed in his mind from a burden to be maintained, alone into a foundation for rebuilding family connections. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began implementing the changes necessary for managing his health condition. But tonight he felt hopeful about the future in a way that had seemed impossible just a week ago. The farmhouse that had felt increasingly empty and isolated was about to become the center of a renewed sense of family and community. Earl's acceptance of help hadn't diminished his independence. It had redefined it in terms that acknowledged both his limitations and his continued capacity for growth and change. At 67, he was learning that the strongest people weren't those who never needed help, but those who were wise enough to accept it when it was offered with love. 6 months later, Earl sat on his front porch watching Tommy and Julie work together in Martha's old flower garden, preparing the beds for spring planting. The morning air carried the scent of rich earth and new growth, and the sound of their quiet conversation mixed with birdsong in a symphony that spoke of renewal and hope. The changes to the farmhouse had been completed gradually over the winter months, transforming the old building into something that bridged the gap between Earl's desire for independence and the practical requirements of managing his chronic kidney disease. The medical alert system had been installed discreetly, providing peace of mind without making the house feel like a medical facility. The medication management system sat on the kitchen counter next to Martha's old coffee percolator, a modern necessity that had found its place among familiar comforts. Earl's latest blood work had shown stable kidney function, evidence that the careful management of his condition was working. Dr. Chun had expressed satisfaction with his compliance with medication schedules and dietary restrictions, and Earl had surprised himself by discovering that the structure imposed by his medical routine actually made his days feel more purposeful rather than more constrained. Tommy had settled into the garage apartment with an ease that suggested he belonged there, working remotely for his Seattle company. while being available for the practical support that made Earl's independent living possible. The arrangement had proven beneficial for both of them. Tommy enjoyed the rural setting and slower pace of life, while Earl appreciated having family nearby without feeling like he was being constantly supervised. The relationship between Tommy and Julie had rekindled slowly over the winter months, built on the foundation of shared history and deepened by their mutual care for Earl's well-being. They moved carefully around each other, both aware of the pain that had accompanied the end of their previous relationship, but also hopeful about the possibility of creating something new and lasting. Earl watched them work together in the garden and saw echoes of the partnership he'd shared with Martha, two people who cared about the same things, who found satisfaction in practical accomplishments, who could work side by side without the need for constant conversation. There was talk of marriage in the air, though nothing had been formally announced. Earl kept his opinions to himself, but he found himself quietly preparing for the possibility of grandchildren playing in the yard where Tommy had once learned to ride a bicycle. Frank and Dorothy Kowalski had become regular visitors, dropping by for coffee and conversation with the comfortable frequency of old friends. Frank often helped Tommy with the heavier farm maintenance tasks, while Dorothy had appointed herself as Earl's dietary supervisor, ensuring that his kidney-friendly meals were both nutritious and palatable. Their support had been invaluable during Earl's adjustment to his new medical routine. The financial aspects of Earl's medical care had been resolved more successfully than anyone had anticipated. The hospital's charity care program had covered the majority of his emergency treatment costs, and his ongoing medical expenses were manageable thanks to Medicare supplemental insurance that Julie had helped him navigate. The crisis that had begun with Earl's fear of medical bills had taught him that the healthcare system, while complex and sometimes intimidating, contained resources for people in his situation. Earl's daily routine now revolved around the rhythm of medication schedules and regular exercise, but he'd found ways to incorporate these requirements into activities that felt meaningful rather than burdensome. His morning walks had become a time for reflection and appreciation of the changing seasons. His careful attention to diet had led him to rediscover cooking as a creative outlet, experimenting with kidney-friendly recipes that honored Martha's memory while accommodating his current needs. The farm itself had found new purpose under the today. Shared care of 3 generations. Tommy had taken over the more physically demanding maintenance tasks, while Earl continued to manage the vegetable garden and chicken coop with the careful attention to detail that had always been his strength. Julie contributed her knowledge of nutrition and health, helping to optimize their food production for Earl's dietary requirements. Chester, the old rooster, had become something of a barometer for Earl's well-being, seeming to sense when his caretaker was having a good day or struggling with the side effects of medication. The bird had developed the habit of following Earl around the yard during his morning chores, a companionship that Earl found both amusing and comforting. The 1967 Chevelle that had sat unfinished in the barn for years was finally nearing completion, a project that Tommy had embraced with enthusiasm during the winter months. Working on the car together had become a way for father and son to reconnect while accomplishing something tangible and meaningful. They planned to take Martha on a drive through the countryside that summer, visiting places she'd loved and creating new memories while honoring old ones. Earl's perspective on independence had evolved significantly over the months since his accident. He'd learned to distinguish between autonomy, the ability to make his own decisions, and isolation, the stubborn refusal to accept help when it was needed. The former remained precious to him, while the latter had revealed itself as a form of pride that could be genuinely dangerous. The medical alert system had been activated only once, when Earl had experienced a dizzy spell while feeding the chickens. The response had been swift and reassuring. Tommy had appeared within minutes, followed shortly by Julie, who had determined that the episode was likely related to a minor medication adjustment rather than a serious medical emergency. The incident had reinforced Earl's confidence in the safety net they'd created, while reminding him that his condition required ongoing vigilance. As spring progressed into early summer, Earl found himself looking forward rather than backward for the first time since Martha's death. The grief remained, would always remain, but it had been joined by anticipation for the future, for Tommy and Julie's wedding, for potential grandchildren, for the continued evolution of his relationship with his son, for the simple pleasure of watching another growing season unfold on land that had been his life's work. The duct tape that had started this entire chain of events now resided in Earl's toolbox as a reminder, rather than a primary solution. He still believed in practical approaches to problems, but he'd learned to recognize when professional help was required, and when accepting assistance was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. On this particular morning, as Earl watched his son and the woman who might soon be his daughter-in-law prepare the garden for another year of growth, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected blessings that had emerged from his medical crisis. The accident that had seemed like a disaster had become the catalyst for rebuilding relationships, discovering health problems before they became life-threatening, and creating a living situation that honored both his need for independence and his requirements for support. Martha's presence remained strong in the house and on the farm, but it had been joined by new life and new possibilities. Earl had learned that honoring the past didn't require freezing it in place, that moving forward didn't mean abandoning what had come before. The farmhouse that had felt like a mausoleum was once again a home filled with activity, conversation, and hope for the future. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher in the sky, Earl rose from his rocking chair and walked down to join Tommy and Julie in the garden. There was work to be done, relationships to nurture, and life to be lived fully within the constraints that age and illness had imposed. But those constraints, Earl had learned, didn't have to limit joy or connection or the satisfaction that came from being part of something larger than oneself. Sometimes, he reflected as he knelt beside the flower bed that Martha had planted decades ago, the best solutions to life's problems weren't found in toolboxes or learned through stubborn determination. Sometimes they were discovered through the willingness to accept help, to admit vulnerability, and to trust that love could find ways to adapt to changing circumstances without losing its essential character. Earl Whitcomb had wrapped his leg wound with duct tape because hospitals cost too much. But the nurse couldn't believe it, and her disbelief had led to discoveries and changes that made his remaining years richer than any he'd experienced since Martha's death. It was, he thought as he helped plant flowers that would bloom long after the memory of his accident had faded, a pretty good outcome for such a foolish beginning.